Welcome, everyone, to our WLT on the craft of writing short fiction, a conversation with Elizabeth McCracken and Thisbe Nissen. I feel so lucky to be here with you tonight. My name is Becca Oliver. I'm the executive director at the Writers League of Texas. We are thrilled to be able to put on programs like this throughout the year. And I'm especially excited to join these two authors who I admire a great deal and hear them talk about their work, which is pretty special and wonderful in this category, especially. They write a lot of things. We're going to get into their bios, but to read their short stories is to really see the art at its highest form. So thank you so much to both of you. We're going to get into it. I want to remind you really quickly that if you have questions for our authors, please put them into the Q&A because it'll be a little harder for us to find it in the chat box. You should be able to see the Q&A option either at the bottom or at the top of your screen. First up, Elizabeth McCracken is the author of 7 books. Here's Your Hat, What's Your Hurry, The Giant's House, Niagara Falls All Over Again, an exact replica of a figment of my imagination, Thunderstruck and Other Stories, Bowl Away, and her most recent collection of short stories, The Souvenir Museum. She's received grants and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Liguria Study Center, the American Academy in Berlin, the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, and the Radcliffe Institution for Advanced Study. Thunderstruck and Other Stories won the 2015 Story Prize. Her work has been published in the Best American Short Stories, the Pushcart Prize, the O. Henry Prize, the New York Times Magazine, and many other places. Thank you so much for being here, Elizabeth. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
We're going to clap it up in the chat box, everyone. That's our option for these virtual events. And then we're also joined by Thisbe Nissen, who's the author of 3 novels, Our Lady of the Prairie, Osprey Island, The Good People of New York, and 2 story collections, Out of the Girls' Room and Into the Night, the winner of the John Simmons Short Fiction Award, and How Other People Make Love. She's also the co-author with Aaron Ergenbright of the Ex-Boyfriend Cookbook, a collection of stories, recipes, and art collages. Her fiction has been published in the Iowa Review, the American Scholar, 17, and the Virginia Quarterly Review, and anthologized in the Iowa Award, The Best Stories, 1991 to 2000, and Best American Short Mystery Stories. Her nonfiction has appeared in Vogue, Glamour, Preservation, and The Believer, and is featured in several essay anthologies. She has been the recipient of fellowships from the James Michener Copernicus Society, the University of Iowa, Breadloaf Writers Conference, Yaddo, and the MacDowell Colony, and was the 19th Zale Writer-in-Residence at Tulane University. She has taught at Columbia University, the Iowa Writers Workshop, Brandeis University, the New School's Eugene Lang College, and in the Low Residency MFA program at Pacific University. These days, she teaches undergrad MFA and PhD students at Western Michigan University. Thisbe, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I think, happily, that concludes our presentation. So here we go. So I want to mention that many of our wonderful attendees have had the chance, we sent them links to read 2 stories by one from each of your collections ahead of the event. So for those of you who didn't read the stories, don't worry, this conversation is going to be very satisfying regardless, but I did want to mention them both here because we'll be referencing them at times. So the 2 stories are Elizabeth's story that opens her collection, The Irish Wedding, and Thisbe's 5th story in her collection, We Shall Go to Her and She Will Not, but She Will Not Return to Us. But before we dive in too much further, I wanted to ask you both, as writers, you have many published works. You have published novels, you've published short stories, collections of short stories, a memoir, personal essays, a cookbook. So I'm just wondering from each of you where this form, short fiction, the short story, falls in that long list of ways that you express yourself and that you create stories. What does short fiction mean to you? And I'm going to start with you, Elizabeth.
Okay, I feel startled. I just want to say I am so thrilled to be here with the Writers League and with Thisbe, whose work I just adore. I love this book. I also was really thinking when I saw the graphic that our books are very attractive next to each other. The covers are just really, really nice. What do short stories mean to me? I am old enough that even though I disagree with this piece of wisdom, that I was told that short stories were apprentice work for novels, and that you should work on a short story and then you would know how it was to finish it, and then you could go on and write novels. And I wrote a lot of short stories in the 1980s thinking that that was so. And the longer that I write, and the longer that I write short stories, the more I think that's wrong-headed. And I love writing novels. I really love writing short stories. And part of it is just that ability to whether I'm writing one or reading one, to hold a universe in the palm of my hand and to be able to turn it around and go back and reread paragraphs, or go back and reconceive paragraphs if I'm writing something. And I think they're my favorite. I might just be saying that because I've just published a collection of stories and I'm now working on a novel. And so I'm thinking, oh, it was so much better when I was spending my days writing short stories. But that's how I think.
Can I ask just a follow up on that? When you say that you hold the world in your hand and that you can, do you mean that you can take a paragraph and sort of change it within a story and just completely change the world by changing that paragraph? Or can you talk just a little bit more about what that is?
I guess I mean, when I'm working on a short story and I hit a roadblock, I can reconceive it and not necessarily entirely revise it that day, but I can shift it in a day. And when I first have an idea for it, I can have a good idea of what the whole story will be like and turn it around before I even start writing it. And it's not theoretical in the way that it is if I'm working on a novel, when I'm full of delusions of grandeur, but I also know the minute I start writing something, I'm going to have to be humbled very soon. That may be it. One of the reasons I like writing short stories is that I am humbled less often. Humbled, absolutely, definitely, but not in the in the mud and dismay when I write novels.
And for shorter periods of time. No. Thisbe, what about you? What does short fiction writing mean to you?
You know, it's so interesting, and it brings up a million questions for me too, about, you know, how do you know when something is like, when something has the legs to be a story or a novel, or, you know, I work a lot in flash fiction too, and I especially work with students a lot in flash fiction, and that's sort of another way of conceiving. But I love, Elizabeth, the idea that popped into my mind when you said that you can take it and sort of look at it from angles. And I feel like that's what I'm often describing to students, and anyone out there who's been in my classes will recognize this, but that, like, we're always talking about, like, well, what makes something a story? Like, what gives it storyhood? Like, why is this a story? What do you or what do you want from a story as a reader, as a writer? What do you ask a story to do? What gives you a feeling of satisfaction in reading or writing a story? And I always kind of move to this idea of a story being something that you can kind of step back from and kind of study from different angles. Whereas a novel, you are sort of at every stage, like, drowning in it. Like, you can't you can't get outside and see it. You can attempt to, you could make, big flow charts on your wall and, attempt to gain some sort of perspective. But there is something about a short story that you do feel like a little bit more like you can step back and kind of like walk around to the other side of the room and say, like, what does it look like from this angle? What does it look like from this angle? And there is something really satisfying about that process for me. I think even, and my novels are probably to some degree evidence of this, that even when I'm working in a longer form, I use the idea of stories as a means of entering pieces of the novel when like the whole big novel of it just feels too overwhelming and insurmountable. And I sort of approach by saying, like, let me just focus in and see if I can look at this little piece of it for a little bit.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. We have a question, actually. Folks sent some questions in ahead of time, so we're going to circle back to that in a little bit. So I want to talk about, this is such a big and very vague topic, writing short fiction. So I want to focus it as much as I can, but starting with some of the choices that go into crafting a story. And I want to talk about beginnings. So Thisbe, I love this first line from the story that we shared. Nearly 4 years ago, a born-again duo came through Pulverdale to gig at the Fall Harvest Festival and stayed just long enough to knock up C.C. Carver's older sister, Dane, a 16-year-old atheist with a weakness for men who sang harmony. It's such a great first line. And there's so much going on in that sentence, right? And I read it and I thought, sold. Like, I'm in. Whatever happens next. I kind of hope the duo comes back, but I figured that they weren't going to. I love how Cece's is the first name that we hear, and the story is from her point of view. But even in that first sentence, you know that Dane is the one you're going to be watching for. And it's a story of a family coming together for a wedding, which is actually similar theme, or at least topic, to Elizabeth's story that we shared. It's the return of the prodigal daughter to disrupt everything. So here's the question. Where did Cece and Dane Carver come from? But even more than that, when we talk about crafting that story, why Cece's point of view?
Yeah. It's a good question and a hard one. So especially for me with these stories, like the stories in this collection are really like my first story collection came out 22 years ago now, which is sort of insane to me to think about, but it was 22 years ago. And these are the stories collected in How Other People Make Love are really like the semi-traditional length stories that I have written in the past 22 years. So some of them really go back pretty far. And I know that We Shall Go to Her, But She Will Not Return to Us goes back really pretty far. There were pieces of it. I remember a graveyard that had a Babyland section in it, and I now I don't even remember where it was, but I remember. And then Kevin Brockmeyer, who's here somewhere in the audience, and I got pegged to do like a tag team writing thing with the great Dave Daly, who used to edit books at the Hartford Courant, and so I don't even remember how it started, but Kevin and I sort of had this like setting, and we went back and forth with this, and then I took that setting and spun my own story out of it. But like, I don't remember anymore. My stories often come together like collages, and that's often the way I talk to them, or like quilts, which my students get sick of me talking about how everything is really a quilt in my mind. But, so I've got Babyland, and I've got the Born Again folk singers, and I've got the waterbed, and I've got this guy named Bear, and I'm sort of taking them and putting them next to each other and seeing how they might fit and what the pieces might do to one another as I combine them.
You know, one of the reasons I wanted to ask this question, and especially about Cece's point of view, and maybe you could speak to this not just in this story, but I noticed this in other stories as well, is the point of view really, you know, it's about that person watching another character, and sort of, you know, we learn about that character through, I mean, this is, you know, nothing new, but I love the way you did it here, that I started thinking, okay, this is Cece's wedding. I mean, Cece's who I'm here for, but really it was about Cece being able to tell us about Dane and her place in that family, and the family's relation to, you know, both to her mother and her father, and just everything through that point of view. So I guess that question of how you choose that point of view character for a story.
You know, it's interesting in that one too, because there's a line I think really early in the story where Cece's voice kind of goes off a little bit on, you know, her own situation over, and then she says, but this was about Dane. And she like, and that line I remember puzzling me even in the drafting of it, like why did I leave that line in there? Like, why not? Why wasn't that just a Thisbe note to self? Like, hey, remember you were using Cece's voice to write a story about Dane, but you know, why keep that in there? And then something kept compelling me to keep that line in there, like that Cece has to bring herself back to the story she's trying to tell, or figuring out why she's trying to tell it. And maybe that's part of what interests me, is like, I think maybe I was trying to figure out Dane as much as Cece was trying to figure out Dane, and understand. And what do you do when you're trying to figure out people you don't understand? You write stories about them and see if you can figure it out, or you tell their stories and see if that brings you any closer to understanding.
Right. Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts on sort of how you determine point of view, which character is sort of going to be your focus character for a story?
Sure. I have to apologize. I'm having an allergic reaction.
Oh no.
I think I put on my face. It only means that I look like I'm weeping, but I'm really happy to be here. So it's not serious.
Do you need to do something though?
No, I'm fine. Yeah. I'm just going to look really verklempt, and I'm going to keep touching my eyes. I put on, this is like one of the side effects of the pandemic, right? I don't normally put on moisturizer right before an event, and I put it on, and I'm weeping a little bit, but I'm very happy to be here. And I love that line in Thisbe's story, but this is about Dane. And I also, the North Dodge, Iowa City Cemetery had a baby last.
That must be it.
And one of the things that fascinates me about Thisbe's story is sort of what feels like the strangeness of the point of view to me, that sort of alights on people when it should be alighting on people. It doesn't feel like a close third. It's very sort of eccentric and lovely.
You do that too, all over the place. I mean, I'm so, and the point of view stuff is always my fascination, but those places where you just so seamlessly jump into the kid for a little while, you know, and then out, and we don't even realize we've been there until like, oh, wow, we're in his head, amazing. Sorry.
But I mean, to me, that's the pleasure of point of view. And I do feel like even though I think common wisdom is that you're not allowed to play with point of view as much in a short story, I actually think that you can play with it more, that you have this ability to do what you want. That's one of the great pleasures of writing short stories, is that it's going to be over pretty soon. And so you're requiring less attention and in some ways emotional connection from your readers, because it's shorter, so you can require more of them in some ways too. And I feel like when it comes to point of view, why the hell not say, I don't care what the conventional wisdom is for point of view, even though I think mostly in the Irish Wedding, I think it's mostly close third person. I'm saying that because it is amazing what I forget about anything that I ever write. I have no idea, but I think it's mostly close third. And so, Becca, this is like not really a useful answer to you, which is that I think about point of view like dancing. And whenever I give metaphors for another art form or any practical knowledge when it comes to writing, I know nothing about dancing. I do not know about the thing that I'm comparing writing to. But I think that people, when it comes to point of view in short fiction or in novels too, they want to have a sense of rules. And that it always feels to me like dancing while looking at your feet. And at a certain point, you have to sort of think, I'm switching to this point of view because that's where I need to be right now. Like, it makes logical sense. And that's generally speaking, if I'm writing third person and I'm shifting points of view, it's not based on a decision, but more of a feel, I think.
I love that you said that about novels versus short stories and point of view. And what initially popped into my head was, and I mean this not maybe in the way it'll sound, but that the stakes aren't as high in short story if you change the point of view, because in a novel, someone might come to you at the end of the draft and have you unravel the whole freaking thing and go back and deal with that. But if you're in a short story, you have a little more of that sort of freedom of movement and not quite so much of a worry about, what might happen on the revision side of things too, if that makes sense. But
I think that's totally true. And you also won't have readers going, but I missed this other character's point of view. I'm like, you're going to get back to that character.
Yeah.
But it's all going to be over soon.
Yeah, it's all going to be over soon. Speaking of that, so Elizabeth, your story, The Irish Wedding, takes place over a weekend. Sadie and Jack have flown to Ireland from America, and she is meeting Jack's family for the first time, right? I want to talk about the choices you make as a short story writer about time, or about, as my friend Mary Helen referred to it the other night, the clock on the story, how you're going to contain this story as you approach it. And I'm just wondering that, especially for short fiction versus maybe a novel, that is something that's really important to kind of understand going at least somewhat close to the beginning of crafting the story. So can you talk a little bit about that, about sort of that idea of the clock, or, as it plays out in The Irish Wedding or in any of your other stories?
Sure. I bet your friend Mary Helen is my friend Mary Helen.
Oh, I bet she is.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I do think, I hadn't thought about this before, but of the things that I know about a novel or a short story before I start it, that is probably the thing I do know. And that other things may change, and even the clock might shift a little bit, but if I'm working on a novel, I know whether it's over years or a week. I say that. I'm always jealous of reading, when I read novels that take place over a week, because I've never, ever managed to do that. But yeah, that is, I feel like that's actually a very early decision that you have to make. And that's there are many stories, and all of Thisbe's stories in this collection are about weddings.
Yeah.
But it's one of the great things about a wedding, is that you have that clock right away. Besides the fact that they're naturally theatrical, they're naturally these, a big group of disparate people. And I think it's a decision that I always make early, and that it doesn't necessarily feel like a decision as much as just something that I know instinctively.
Mm-hmm.
That it's going to be over a certain period of time.
Well, and so then there's the clock, and then there's also how time passes, right? So there's, what's happening over the weekend, but so I love this line. I don't know, this line made me laugh out loud in your story. This one, it's about midway through the story. The wedding, being a wedding, passed without incident. So it's the Irish wedding. It's all we've been thinking about. You titled it Weddings in the title. And then that simple line that just tells you, yeah, that's not what I'm here for. I'm not here to tell you about that wedding. But then there's another paragraph that, and I know, thank you for letting me read your words too, that happens towards the end that I wanted to read. And for those two sort of juxtaposed and thinking about how time passes in a story. That night they slept in the room of the dead man. What if he died in his bed? Asked Jack. And Sadie, brave for once, said, people have died everywhere. You can hardly avoid it. Come here. And tomorrow they would drive to the Dingle Peninsula, and she would think over and over, I'm going to drive off this road and ruin everything. But she never did. And she told him about the cat and dog and explained to him that she thought his father had purposely made a funny joke. The bride and groom will now cut the cheese. And they both laughed so hard, she had to pull over to the side of the road. And when they recovered, they drove out to Inch, where they were the only people on the beach, and so quickly and laughingly had sex there on the damp sand. There was not a place in all of Ireland that wasn't damp. But what else do you do when you're all alone and liberated? And I love that paragraph because it just takes us completely out of the moment and takes us to, knowing that, okay, Jack and Sadie are good. Like they're going to move past this wedding and there's still going to be this wonderful unit that they went into the wedding as. But just the difference between that, you jump past the wedding with your one quick line on, passed without incident. And then you also give us this beautiful vignette where you go into the future a little bit. So I guess that's all to just hear you talk about passage of time in a story and how you think about that.
Yeah, it makes me think of something that I've heard Ann Patchett, who's a pal of mine, saying, which is that she always knows the plot of a novel that she's writing before she starts writing it, and that it is sort of akin to knowing the map of something and then taking the actual journey. And even though I sort of know the events before I write a short story, those moments of speeding up or collapsing time, I don't know them till I'm going over that piece of territory. Mm-hmm. So I did not plan to write the wedding being a wedding passed without incident, though it pleased me to write it, thinking, yeah, all weddings essentially are about the same, the ceremony themselves. And I didn't know, even though I've got a great weakness, both as a reader and a writer, for flash forwards, I didn't know that I was going to write that until I got there. But and this isn't, I feel like I'm answering your question badly. It's not something that feels technical to me. It feels like, oh, at this moment, it would be great to cover a lot of time in a paragraph. Mm-hmm. And so I try to do it.
Thisbe, what about you? How do you think about both going back to the original question of the clock and then also time passing in a story?
And I've been thinking while you were talking about that kind of compression of a short story and how the clock puts a kind of compression on it, but in the same way that I often find myself talking about stories, but I guess novels too sometimes, but as like, I love things that happen in petri dishes a little bit, or like the petri dish of the world of the story. And sort of you can feel like you can have a little control of it or look at it from up high on your microscope if it's contained in something. And there are lots of ways to contain things. You can contain things in time. And I think that often helps. Like if you have a story where it kind of feels like nothing's happening, or like people are spending a long time trying to make a decision about something, or, and they wind up in a car talking to each other, trying to figure out what to do next, which often happens in drafts of stories. And you think, okay, what do I need to do? I need some there to be some time pressure in here, like something like they can't stay in that car because they're in a 30-minute parking zone and they're gonna get ticketed if they say, you know, like you need something that's gonna press on the characters and make them have to move or have to get out of there or have to be somewhere or something. And so time is very useful in those regards, but also to, you know, so are like space or something like I or like the idea of the wedding, which is a compact period of time. It's like you're going to have to go here and here and see these people and these people, and then everybody has plane tickets to get the hell out of there at the end, you know. And so like what's going to happen inside that little petri dish? So I think time is another way of like, I mean, I don't think of this at all, like Elizabeth's saying, like I don't think of this at all while I'm writing, but it's a way of putting pressure on a story or on characters.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this sort of leads me to the next thought that I was having when I was thinking about this conversation, and I was thinking about the difference for me as a reader, the difference of in that experience of reading short stories versus reading a novel. And again, I don't want this to come off the wrong way in terms of novels, but when I approach a short story, there's an anticipation and excitement about it. I think that of course I have when I approach novels, but it's different because you know you have this small amount of time, these handful of pages, and that in those pages, the character's going to be changed. I'm probably going to be changed. Something's going to happen and I'm going to come out on the other side. So I want to talk about, first I want to talk about story length. And we sort of touched on this a little bit. I'm guessing maybe the answer is a story is as long as a story needs to be. But if there are any thoughts you have in terms of, as you're crafting, do you have an idea of whether, you know, I would assume Thisbe, and maybe this is incorrect, that you set out to write a flash fiction piece, that you're not necessarily just discovering you set out to write a story and it turns out it's flash fiction. But in terms of, and I would love to hear you talk a little bit about your writing of flash fiction, but in terms of the stories that we're talking about in these collections, do you have a sense of how long they're going to be and you know how much space you need for those stories going into it? Thisbe, you're nodding, so I'm going right back to you.
I have an answer, and then I have a follow-up question for Elizabeth, like with regard to your question. So one for me, and I'm gonna really annoyingly pull out my quilt metaphor again, which is sort of the idea that like for me, like a piece of flash fiction, it's like there's one little moment, you know, usually for me, and that's not to say all flash fiction is like that, but for me, it's often one image. There's a singularity to it, you know. It's like a little placemat quilt or something, you know. It's like it's small and contained. And say a short story often for me, and it's the collaging, and like I'll sort of collect pieces. Like I've been collecting like deer anecdotes, you know, and sort of I get to a place where the anecdotes about deer, you know, I've got all these notes all over, like, oh, that dead deer on the road there, or that hunter saying this about deer, or that deer strapped to somebody's car, or the story someone told me about the deer in the dumpster, you know. And at some point, like, I've got enough of those, and I start looking at them and they start becoming something together, or they start speaking to each other. And that to me feels like a short story, like a small quilt. Like I've got this idea of the shape of it, or how much material it is that I'm actually working with. Whereas like a novel is much more like, okay, I got all this blue and I got all this pink and I'm thinking sky, you know. And it's sort of it's much more like, oh, but wait, I could pull that thing out of the closet there and maybe stick it into, and there's like, there's a lot more ranginess and like pulling things out that you never even thought you'd use or something. So I think for me it has to do with the like the focus or the quantity of material. But so my follow-up question on those lines for Elizabeth is like, reading the Souvenir Museum, one can't help but note that there are several Jack and Sadie stories. And so and I wonder, I have no idea, were Jack and Sadie like going to be a novel at one point, but didn't? Were Jack and Sadie like, did you keep just exploring pieces of them? Did you think maybe they're a novel, or do they only exist in stories? And not that any of those answers are great or no answer at all, but there's that feeling of like, they are autonomous stories unto themselves, and like what makes the Jack and Sadie stories to you and not pieces of a novel, say, if they're not, maybe they are. You get the question.
I love it.
They're definitely short stories. And I was sitting there thinking my current favorite metaphor, because I've been watching a lot of magic, is magic tricks. And one of the things I was thinking this in terms of speeding up and slowing down time. One of the reasons like I like those moments of flashing forward, it's like in a magic trick or in a magic act where you suddenly produce a bouquet of flowers or a garland of scarves out of your sleeve. That's not a word. Sleeve. Sorry. Your sleeve. And it's beautiful. However, the flowers are not real flowers. The pleasure is in how quickly they appear. And to me, that's the pleasure of short stories. And it's one of the reasons why those connected Jack and Sadie stories are short stories and not a novel. They were always short stories. And I have a novel that once got broken down to short stories, but these short stories, I was trying to write a bunch of short stories in a short period of time, and it made more sense for them to be connected. And it was so pleasurable to do that. Partly because I'd never done that before. And this ability to start again in a new short story with people I already knew without any of this is a terrible thing to say because I love connected short stories. So I don't mean to suggest that I think that they're easier than writing distinct short stories or a novel, but the ability to write about people who I already knew was just joyous. I had never done it before. And so then I wrote 5 of them.
Have either of you written a novel that started as a short story?
Yeah, I in different ways. And my first novel, Good People of New York, started as actually my first novel, which is my MFA thesis, which was never published, was 2 stories about the same characters, and it was sort of like them meeting and them breaking up, and I spent 2 years of my MFA figuring out what happened in between, and that was and then similarly I had 2 short stories that both featured a woman. One was of her as a young woman, and one was her sort of grown up divorced with raising a daughter, and had this love like, this woman Sheila, I think maybe she might be Roz, but 20 years on, like what would happen there? So again, it was sort of, how did one get to the other? So I have, and that's definitely like a building block for me, or a way to conceive of things.
Can we talk about endings of stories? I have a few other questions, and then we will absolutely get to folks' questions too in the Q&A. But, Thisbe, I was thinking about your story that we shared and how it really essentially ends where it began, on this driveway with these two sisters. This time the car is pulling away versus pulling in. What are you thinking about when you're ending a story? What do you want the ending to do?
That's a hard one. I feel like I used to say, I always write too much at the end. I always talk too much. I always say too much. I always write too much. And I would need somebody else to come in and kind of cut it off and say like, nope, and right there, Thisbe, like that's the end. And maybe over the years, I've kind of come to be able to do that myself a little more, of saying like, stop trying to wind it up, or I know how to cut myself off a little bit more. That to me, for that story, felt very much like where it had to end. That's like about the visitation by Dane, and the fact that when she comes, it's with the child, and when she leaves, it's without the child, and that's sort of
and she's not coming back. Yeah.
And people have often asked me that, and that's my thought in it. She's
not coming back.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think, and Elizabeth, for the Irish wedding, I read that paragraph of the sort of the flash forward, but really we come back into that wonderful moment when Sadie is just laughing at the wedding, and the father is saying, someone make her stop laughing, and just sort of end in her just releasing a lot of tension is what I'm thinking. But what are you thinking about when you end stories? And I guess I'd be interested also if you knew that you were going to continue telling stories about Jack and Sadie at that moment when you ended the Irish wedding.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the end of Thisbe's story, and my favorite piece of wisdom about the ends of short stories, which is from a piece that William Boyd wrote as part of an introduction. If any of my students are listening, I say this entirely too much. But William Boyd wrote an introduction to an anthology of great short stories, and he said that one of the things that great short stories do at the end is that they lead to a complexity of afterthought. And to me, that complexity of afterthought is the big thing that separates novel endings from short story endings. That there is something unresolved and complex at the end of all of the short stories that mean anything to me. Whereas novels can actually, you can finish a novel and think, and give it a fond little pat on its back and think, that is that. And I'm thinking about that ending when Dane goes away, where I saw somebody in the chat said, she just went to the bar. And I love that the resonance at the end of that story, where you're unsettled because you don't know the end, in the same way at the beginning and throughout it, you don't know which of the folk singers is Trevor's father. And I did know when I finished that story that I was going to write more Jack and Sadie stories, because I think that was the second or third story that I wrote. It's the first one in the book, but I wrote those 5 stories, and then they don't appear in the order of writing. But the thing that I do sort of want my readers at the end of a short story to feel struck like a gong, so that their heads are still ringing at the end of a story. I don't feel that way about writing novels.
I'm pretty sure Bear is Trevor's dad. Am I right?
I don't think so. No, I think it was one of the folk singers.
I went there. I went there when you talked about their relationship, and you can see, just made my own conclusions. So, and also Elizabeth, follow up. Where do you watch magic?
Well, I've been obsessively watching Penn and Teller's Fool Us on the CW,
Wonderful.
which is, I know people have all been watching Kate Winslet in something that I know is probably really wonderful. But Fool Us is the TV show that's gotten me through the pandemic, because it's about people who are incredibly good at their job, appreciating other people who are incredibly good at their jobs. It's this, the setup is that magicians come and perform one magic trick for Penn and Teller. And if Penn and Teller can tell you how you did your trick, then you don't get a trophy. But if they can't tell, then you get a trophy. And it's like this reality show in which it's 4 happy endings, because even if they can't tell you, even if they can tell you how you did your trick, you got to do magic for Penn and Teller.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. So I do that. But in Austin, although I haven't been there since the pandemic started, there's an amazing magic theater owned by a single magician out sort of on the Austin Dripping Springs line called John Magic's Theater. And he is a world-class magician who has his own theater in Texas.
I love knowing this about you, your magic habit. Let's talk about titles. How do you possibly name a story? Because it seems like titles for stories, look, titles are pressure filled for novels, of course, but at the end of the day with novels, a million people are going to have an opinion, and it's going to kind of go through that publishing machine. Short stories, it feels like there's a lot of pressure on the title of a short story. So I guess I'm just curious whether you would agree with that or not, and how you approach titles.
Thisbe is the best at titles.
She's got some
titles. I'll title other people. I love titles. I love that feeling of the title kind of being almost like your last chance as a writer to say, like, maybe think about this while you're reading it. You don't have much of a chance. You want to step back as the writer. You don't want to be there as the other. Allison just put in the chat, "This been entitling my story since 1997. We used to be like, stories by Allison Naiman, titles by Thisbe Nissen." Favorite thing to do. A painter once, when I was at the McDowell Colony, a painter let me help title her paintings, and it was amazing. Like, I got to sit with her and talk about like what was going on with this painting, like where did it come from, and I would be like listening to things she said and pulling out phrases. I mean, I love doing it with my student stories, like pulling phrases out and putting them in title case at the top of the story, and I'll just try all kinds of different ones, seeing like, what does it do to shape the reading of it? How does a certain title shift your energy or attention or something as you're going through it? I had so many questions about there are a bunch of titles, Elizabeth, that you use where the title was not didn't jump out at me in the story. It wasn't like, here's a line that got pulled out, and I'm pretty sure. And I'm so curious as to where some of those came from, like the final story, nothing, darling, only darling, darling.
My favorite. It's my favorite. Yeah. Elizabeth, what about you? How do you approach titles, and where did you come up with that wonderful title?
So that title is a cartoon, I think, from the New Yorker, that is a man and a woman sitting. There's also a T-shirt from the Moomin shop. It's a panel from the Moomins. I don't know if you guys know the Moomins. Tove Jansson, one of the geniuses of the 20th century. She wrote a book that's that I feel like has come back into vogue, called The Summer Book, which has been republished by the New York Book Review Books. But she also did these children's books in a comic strip called The Moomins that are, I can't recommend them enough. I can't explain them. She was Finnish, and just a genius, a writer and illustrator. And this sort of imaginary group of sort of trolls called the Moomin Trolls. And there's a great panel from one of her comic strips, even though it comes from this older comic in which one of the Moomin Trolls is saying to the other, "What did you say?" And then the other Moomin Troll says, "Nothing, darling, only darling, darling." I just as something to say to somebody you love, I love it so much as being this sort of both like full of love and mysterious and not useful, or like not directly applicable to anything. Yeah, I walked into a store and saw the Moomin t-shirt and thought, I have to use that for something at some point.
And so is that common for you, that a title might just actually be something that you love in a different way, but it happens to be perfect for a story? I mean, what are you thinking when you're in general? I mean, not in general, but give some idea. I mean, obviously the Irish Wedding, the Irish Wedding could have been many different titles. It's actually the simplicity of it feels really perfect. But what are you thinking when you're titling?
I mean, different things. One of the reasons why I called the Irish Wedding, besides the fact that it is a wedding and takes place in Ireland, but I also really like the fact that no Irish people appear anywhere in the story. That somehow the people who are in it are sort of like, yes, it's an Irish wedding, completely free of anybody who is actually Irish.
Yeah.
And I love the story that in Thisbe's book, there are some glosses on titles, but I don't think that there is on We Shall Go to Her, but She Will Not Return to Us. I don't think you explain that. And I love that title. And it's more information for a short story in a title than I'm used to. And I love it so deeply.
I think there may have been drafts of that story where that was explicitly on one of the graves in Babyland.
Oh.
Then it felt like I didn't need it to be there. It had the same tone as the inscriptions on the graves, but it could also apply to Dane as well. So yeah, that I think I pulled it from the story, so it wasn't sort of that like there it is, okay, like here's the hunt for where the title came from in the story, and it felt like I could pull it out and it would still have that same resonance, but not have that like gotcha sort of thing that can be a little annoying.
My favorite, and it's so hard because you are really gifted with titles, but as you know, Thisbe, but I love You Were My Favorite Scarecrow, because the story, and I also really love that story, and the I think it might be the second story in the collection, and just this really beautiful look at losing a spouse and then losing right? Am I thinking of the right story? You Were My Scarecrow? Yeah. But then the explanation for the title, where you're talking about the Wizard of Oz, and that moment where Dorothy says, "You were my favorite Scarecrow," in front of the lion and the Tin Man, and you're sort of, it just, I love it. I love it because the title on its own almost seems like a different title. And then when you realize it in the context of what you're talking about, it's just perfect. So, yeah.
I had to fight a little bit for that title. There were people all along the way who really felt strongly that there needed to be a comma.
Yeah.
that like really strongly. And there was something I have always just really liked the idea that that yes, when she says it, it's saying you, Scarecrow, were my favorite, but then the idea of also you were my favorite Scarecrow, like that everyone is a scare. That I loved so much that like that I couldn't have the comma be there. Fights over commas. This is what we do. We fight over commas.
I mean, pick your battles, and that was a battle that you picked rightly.
Thank you.
Okay, here we go. I'm jumping in to some of the questions. One person, someone's asking, when do you have time to write a short story when you're writing a novel? So I guess that I'll flip that around a little bit and ask, do you write simultaneously? Do you write, if you're writing a novel, are you writing a novel, or are you like, I might dabble in a little short story over here this weekend because I'm just not, this novel's not giving me what I need. Are you guys committed to one or the other, or do you jump around? Elizabeth, I'm looking at your face.
It's the thing about Zoom.
Yeah, you can't get my cues.
You can't actually look, give people withering looks or pointed looks or comforting looks. Just give everybody that look. So I never switch. I may take a break from a novel and think, okay, I'm not able to write this right now, and then write a short story, but I don't ever stop writing one for the other. And that's partially just because I'm undisciplined and a garbage disposal of a writer. And if I have an idea, I'll try to cram it into whatever I'm writing. But also, I like all the discipline I have is quite measured. And so I tell myself, okay, you're working on a novel right now. That's what you have to work on. Because if I gave myself permission to switch, I'd like to switch every day or every hour. So
yeah. How about you, Thisbe?
I actually started writing flash fiction really when I was in grad school and working on this first novel, and I was kind of working on it in this way of saying, like, I don't know how to write a novel. Like I'm flailing in this stuff. I don't know what I'm doing. And it had that feeling of like, this is never going to be done. How am I ever going to figure out? And there was something like I started turning to looking at really short pieces with the idea of like, maybe I could at least just finish something and have some sense of satisfaction, be able to send it out to a journal and, feel like I wasn't just locked away with my big tome for the years it was going to take me to do that. So I think that's definitely something that I do is try to use really short pieces as a way to kind of remind myself that I actually can finish something and, and put a title on it and maybe try and put it out into the world. Harder, I think, to switch like novels and short stories, but I often have stories that sit around for a really long time, like as I try to figure out where they need to go. Like I'll have pieces of it there and drafted, and then I hit a point where I just feel like I don't know if this is anything, I don't know, and so it kind of goes to the side, and then maybe I work on a novel or I work on lots of other things and then I come back to it. So in that sense some of them stick around for quite a while, but it's not usually. I wouldn't sort of be working on a novel and then like turn my attention back to a particular short story like that. That's my brain doesn't have that much capacity that I can't keep that much in it at one time.
Because you just alluded to this a little bit, do you have any suggestions, either of you, for folks who have done a lot of writing of short stories, but haven't actually worked on a novel before and are thinking about starting a novel or novel curious, what maybe you could suggest to them in terms of the way they might either think of it, how they might approach it differently than approaching a short story, or what maybe things you learned along the way as you, because I'm making the assumption here that you both started with short stories. So as you yourself developed into a novelist, what advice can you give for folks who are thinking about it?
Which of us are you looking at?
I'm looking at Thisbe.
Damn. Part of it is, I think it would be really hard to write a novel just because you wanted to write a novel. Like, I think you would have to, or for me at least, to conceive of a novel, I would have to have enough sort of congealing stuff collected in my brain that was lending itself toward a bigger project. So I think that it's for me, in terms of thinking about novels or dipping into one, it gets often like the accretion gets to be too much, and finally it's like, okay, I have to do something with all this stuff because it's just gathering, mold now, or, if I don't start kind of taking it out and doing something with it. And for me though, I didn't say this earlier, but like when my last novel, Our Lady of the Prairie, when I started conceiving of it, it felt really big. It felt like this, and it only got bigger as I started working on it, and, bigger than I even thought in the beginning. And I didn't know how to approach it. And the first foray I made into it was to write what is now a story in this collection called The Church of the Fellowship of Something, which was like, I knew that somewhere in this novel, there was going to be a wedding that took place during, like, there was going to be a wedding that got struck by a tornado, or a tornado was going to come through this wedding. And so I thought, okay, I don't know what I'm doing with this novel. I don't know how to get all these ideas together. But what if I could just try and write that wedding in that tornado? And then I started saying, like, can you use a tornado as a structure for a story? Like, could that work? And I thought, well, I'll give it a try. Who knows? Like, let's see if that works, and so that was a way in for me. And ultimately, like, the point of view is different in the short story than it wound up being in the novel, but it was a place of entry for me, at least. And I think that's what's really hard, and tackling little pieces for me is a lot easier than that idea of like chapter 1, like I can't do that. I don't, that's not the way I work at all. So like right now I'm just starting work on something that feels novelty, I think. And the way I'm conceiving of it is like daily exercises. Like this is my quilt novel, and I am literally like every day I'm like describing a piece of fabric in a quilt and where it came from. And I have a little bit of like the outlying story, but I have a narrator who's saying like that this piece came from here. And then I'm just letting myself go there. And the next day it's a new piece of fabric. And those are ways to, approach novel and all the ideas of novel without overwhelming myself with chapter 1, it was a dark and stormy night, or that's my way of breaking it down into smaller pieces.
Too, that sometimes, there's pressure certainly put on folks who are writing short fiction that, well, that's, as a former literary agent, I would probably say this myself to some folks. Great. I love your stories. I love this potential collection. Do you have a novel in you? And I think there's this idea that, okay, you write short fiction, but then you have to transition into writing a novel, but they're so different that it doesn't, and vice versa. You're writing a novel and someone says to you, it would help you if you got some stories published somewhere. It doesn't mean you're a short story writer because you're able to write a novel. So I imagine, Elizabeth, you probably talk to students about this all the time. They're working on stories, they're thinking about, turning to novels. What sort of advice do you give for someone who wants to give the novel a try?
Well, I mean, I completely agree with Thisbe that I don't think that you can will a novel into being. And there are so many amazing writers who never wrote a novel. Grace Paley, Raymond
Dieback.
Carver, Stuart Dieback. He's got that one book that's sort of like fictions. I Sailed with Magellan, but you know,
Oh yeah, yeah.
a brilliant short story writer. Alice Munro similarly like wrote a book of connected short stories that is sometimes talked about as a novel. These are, you know,
Ed Chang,
yep.
writes amazing short stories, has no interest in ever writing a novel.
And you should never write something that you're not interested in writing. Like maybe that is the basic advice I have for anybody that is applicable to every writer there is. Do not write something you're not interested in writing. If you feel like, for me, the big difference between short stories and novels exists at the character level, and that the difference is that characters in novels are people you don't think you can get to the bottom of over the course of a short story. And that's how I feel. And that if you're interested in writing a novel, the way to do it is to read a lot of novels and to sort of get your brain on that level of timing and setting and character. I really don't know any other way to do it. I feel like many people have tried to trick themselves into writing their first novels, and sometimes it works, but more often I think it fails. That you sort of think, oh, I'm going to have, you know, this many pieces, or I'm a short story writer, as I'm going to write things like they're a short story, and that's somehow the problem is you've given yourself a lot of assignments that you can get to the bottom of while you're writing them, and then the novel isn't expansive enough or deep enough. I say that I can hear me hesitating, some sort of thinking, but it's not that I think that novels are deeper than short stories, because you know some of my favorite pieces of writing in the entire world are short stories. I think they are as deep and can do as much. They're just, I mean, here you go, Becca and Thisbe. This is my big wisdom. Ooh. Novels are bigger than short stories in terms of word count, but maybe nothing else.
There was a reason we asked you onto this panel.
I know. My caliper's out and I can measure whether you're writing a short story or a novel. But I do really think that no matter what art form you're working on, whether it's prose or poetry or painting or music, you have to consume the stuff that does everything that you want to in that form. And that is the best way to start to write it.
Yeah, for sure. So I am aware of time for sure. I do want to ask you a big piece of the sort of next steps with short fiction being submitting to journals and getting those pieces published. So for both of you, obviously you've done this quite a bit. You've had some really nice success with having your pieces published and then also going on to publish story collections. But what advice for folks who are maybe at the beginning of that process, who are just starting, you know, looking back now, if you could go back to your writer selves when you were first starting to submit, what would you tell writers as a piece of advice for facing that beast, the publishing side of things? Elizabeth, I'm looking at you.
It's similar. It's read those magazines. Spend a lot of time. I mean, I think you're quite intelligently off social media. I read Twitter a lot. But one of the things that I know about Twitter is that I see where writers I admire, both people at the beginning of their careers and people who've been around for a while, are publishing. And then you can go and read those magazines. I feel like I sent stuff out when I was a young writer to magazines all of the time, and I didn't read them. I was like looking to see who paid and how quick the turnaround time was. Those were the two things that I cared about. And then when I started actually reading the magazines, I realized I was sending work to magazines that never would have published my work because we just weren't simpatico. And once I started reading magazines and developing an admiration for magazines and editorial interests, I did much better. And there are great magazines out there. Many of them are online only, and they're put together by people who are really devoted to the short story form. And that's what I think is to read and see where you can see your work appearing.
Someone once said this at an event I was at, the idea too of find collections that you think would sit on the shelf next to your collection. So same, similar voice, similar themes, and then look and see, because all of those are going to tell you where those stories were originally published. And that gives you also like a good potential list of publications. Thisbe, what about you? What's your advice for submitting?
I mean, and as people who teach students who are doing this all that, Elizabeth and I are both always talking with people who are in this stage of things, and starting to figure out where they fit in. I think all of those are really good ideas. What you were just saying, Becca, I will also tell people, look at anthologies. Like I used to read, Best American Short Stories, and you can see what the stories that you liked or the stories that you feel some resonance or some kinship with, like where were those originally published? And then you can go back and start reading those journals. And I think it can feel really overwhelming. Like when I started out, I was a senior in college, and my friend Lisa and I set aside, we did a winter term project. We spent the month of January in the Oberlin College Library reading every literary magazine they had and making ourselves these like file folders with notes on every one. And we like just trying to get some idea. And it's even crazier now. This was like pre-internet, now it's so much huger. But I think like I get really excited when when I have students who, are starting to wonder, where do I send my stuff out and how do I find it? And, it does take a bunch of looking at first, but, you do something like you go to a bookstore that stocks literary magazines, or a library, or you go to something like AWP conference or something, and you start, or even online, reading the magazines that you kind of get drawn to because your friend had a piece in there and you really liked your friend's story. And so what else do those people, and that's how you find like your people and your literary community. And often like people with similar interests, like gear towards similar things, or people like your aesthetic, or people who like stories that do certain kinds of things, and you start like honing in on those things, and then also branching out. And then there's, here's a press that often publishes the people who publish stories in this journal and stuff, and you start like the world starts getting larger again, but larger in the sense of like you're finding the people who are going to feed your interests and who feel fed by what you're doing, and there's a reciprocity going on, and that I feel like is what it's all about at this point, is like, how do you sustain yourself as a writer in the world? How do you sustain making art and finding audience and sharing things? And that feels to me like that's where it starts.
Yeah. Such a great note, probably, to bring this conversation to a close. So I want to say, I just love how clearly you both admire each other's work, and how generous you've been tonight to sort of, I know, not only having read each other's stories, but then to really be diving into this conversation and asking each other questions as well. And it's just a beautiful thing. One person did ask this question, so I'm gonna say, present company excluded, would each of you tell us a favorite short story that you have, that if you could tell other folks who are listening to go read this story, is that too much pressure for you? I totally understand if it is.
Panic.
I know, total panic,
life.
like total panic. But I have like the fallbacks of like the stories that I'm always having students go,
Okay.
and so there are those like, but then there's always more than one that comes to mind. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, and maybe it's because it's something that I read when I was really first trying to figure out how to write short stories, and it's a story that kind of always blows my mind when I read it, is and actually there's a caveat because it later became part of a novel, or so I don't know the chronology, maybe Elizabeth does, but it's Michael Cunningham's story, White Angel. And that's like a story that somehow when I'm like teaching or when I'm talking about something, I always sort of come back and I'm like, have you read White Angel? Like, that might be important right now.
All right. We
I
got
think it was
one.
a short story before it was In a Home at the End of the World.
I think it was. That was
like American short stories. But I think it was maybe the start of it.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, do you have anything you want to add to that one?
I thought you were just going to skip over me.
I will. It's a terrible question. You don't.
But the problem is just that I'm thinking of a story, and I think I'm going to get the title wrong, which is a story I teach a lot, which is Yun Lee's story that was in the Paris Review and then in her first book, which I think is called Posterity, which is about the Mao impersonators. I think it's called Posterity, but I'm not positive. That's awful.
We'll look it up. We'll find it. We'll share it in a follow-up email to everybody.
Beautiful and strange and funny and peculiar story.
Well, I just want to thank you both so much for spending the time this evening with us. I know that we've been seeing so much love in the chat box and a lot of people who clearly are super fans of Thisbe Nissen and Elizabeth McCracken, and it's been a great conversation. I've learned a lot, and can't encourage folks enough to go out and buy these two collections, buy everything you can by these authors, but for sure support Bookwoman, our wonderful bookseller partner. Thank you to Susan for being here as well.
Immortality. Edward's in the other room and he just shouted immortality. That's story.
Immortality. White Angel, Immortality. We got the two stories right there.
Thanks, Edward.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Thank you to all of you for tuning in and for being here tonight. We hope you'll check out our programming, come back for something else, and just take care of yourselves and write and read and enjoy this summer to come. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. So great to see you.
Yeah. Take care of yourselves.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.